Welcome to the CSF Author Interview Podcast. I'm Professor Peter Nash from the Griffith University, and today we're very fortunate to be joined by Kevin Winthrop from the Oregon Health and Science University. We discussed one of his papers on the short-term management of Zoster live vaccine in RA treated with TOFA. This is a follow-up letter where he looks at the long-term efficacy of the live vaccine. And to put it in context, even though we know the killed vaccine is more effective, something like 99% of the non-RA population, whereas the Zoster vaccine is about 50% in many parts of the world. So we have to rely on the live attenuated vaccine. It would be nice to know it has long-term efficacy. Welcome, Kevin.
Hi, Peter. The study was a follow-up, as you mentioned, to the prior study we talked about a year or so ago, where we took patients prior to starting tofacitinib or placebo, and we gave them the Zostavax. We waited 3 or 4 weeks after that and then gave them their study drug. And we measured their immune responses. And actually, with our prior publication, we reported the immune responses weren't bad, really no lower than what we would have expected it to be. So, we didn't have a control group, so we didn't control we didn't compare incidence in vaccinated versus incidence in unvaccinated. But among the vaccinated, the incidence rate was, 3.5 or something per 100 patient years, which is about what it is for everybody on TOFA. It's kind of 3.5 to 4 per 100 patient years. So it wasn't markedly lower. We were really hoping to see a much lower response. So it did raise or a lower incidence rate, I should say. So it did raise the question as to whether the vaccine was very effective, because we did not see a low infection rate afterwards.
Okay. And you're still recommending a 3 to 4 week gap between vaccination and having the vaccine if you're going to use it?
Yeah, I recommend a couple of things. That first experience we talked about, if you remember right, 1 out of the 112 people actually disseminated the vaccine, and that was a person, and it turned out it was the only person in the study that had never had chickenpox. They lacked primary immunity. So it was someone who never should have been given the vaccine to begin with. So that experience made me start checking my patients. So actually asking them, number one, if they have a history of chickenpox. It turns out there's plenty of studies that show that that's quite reliable. But if they say no or they don't know, which sometimes your patient doesn't remember no, then I test them and I look to see if they have a positive IgG to VZV. If they do, it means they've been exposed to chickenpox and they're eligible to receive the vaccine. And then, probably waiting 3 weeks is absolutely fine. Maybe even waiting less is fine, but at least from that study, which we adopted this kind of 2 to 4 week window, most people ended up waiting 3 weeks or 4 weeks, and I think that's what I'd continue to do. So again, I'd check the serology first, make sure they're eligible, and then I would wait the 3 or 4 weeks.
And in your letter, you looked at both cell-mediated immunity and humoral immunity. There was roughly a doubling from the change from baseline. Is there a change that you'd consider the minimum clinically important change, and did the benefit immunity last a length of time?
Yeah. So it's interesting. The 5 cases that developed Zoster in this follow-up, 2 of them, if I recall correctly, had absolutely 0 improvement in their cell-mediated immunity. And then a couple had, very limited improvement in their IgG. So it suggested at least 4 out of the 5 people had poor to no vaccine responses. And that might explain why they developed Zoster and the other people didn't. So that's number one. So I do think some people just don't generate good immune responses and are not protected. For the ones that do, presumably it's correlated with protection. We know from other studies that improvement in cell-mediated immunity and IgG, frankly, are correlated with vaccine protection. We know that cell-mediated immunity is really the most important in terms of determining your risk of reactivating or developing shingles. There is no threshold level. It turns out it's a lot of people have tried looking at it, including us, and you can't really find a level above which you're protected and below which you're at risk. It's variable and probably depends on the individual, or clearly it does depend on the individual. So unfortunately, there's no commercial or even lab, scientific test that you could take to say, hey, you're at risk and you need the vaccine.
Right. Did you get a feel for how long the vaccine might last, and comment on boosters?
Yeah. So the only data that I can draw from, well, first of all, there's been very limited Zostavax data collected in patients with rheumatoid arthritis or other autoimmune conditions. So we did a study, Jeff Curtis and I did a study a few years ago where we looked at in population-based databases, and we found, cohorts of RA patients who'd been vaccinated, and we compared the risk of Zoster with similarly aged and sexed and diseased individuals who hadn't been vaccinated. And we were able to see a definite effectiveness of about 50% of the vaccine, which is what I think you mentioned before. And we were able to show that did persist. I mean, that persisted at least for 2 or 3 years. And after that point, it started gradually diminishing, such that at 5 years out, even though there was still some efficacy, it was not statistically significant anymore at that point. The confidence intervals for the incidence estimates between vaccinated and unvaccinated groups overlapped. So it definitely raised 2 things to me. Number one, probably there is some protection here that lasts several years, and probably you need to give a booster vaccination in 2 or 3 years, although no one's ever done that before, to my knowledge, but that would probably be the strategy.
Right. And really just begs the question, when Shingrix is more widespread and available, I've always wondered why it says to have 2 injections 2 to 6 months apart. What's the benefit? 2 months, 6 months? Why do they say that?
Well, ideally it's 2 months, but the window around it extends. Not everyone in the phase 3 made it back exactly at month 2, and in real world, I mean, sometimes you can't get your booster because it's not available, or you can't make it, whatever. It ends up being month 3, month 4. The bottom line is you do need a second shot. You need a booster to boost that efficacy. The efficacy of one shot is not as well established. It's probably lower, like in the 80%, and the efficacy of having the 2-shot series is in the mid 90% for healthy individuals. I presume these numbers are lower for patients with rheumatic diseases. We don't know yet. We're of course starting a couple studies looking at this, as there are others, and hopefully we'll have some better data pretty soon. I think one other thing, just to go back to your prior question, is I think Zostavax is effective to the of the magnitude I was describing before. JAK inhibition is a special situation, and it may be that these vaccines are less effective in people going on JAK inhibitors. I don't know yet. That's an open question.
Okay. And what about steroids and methotrexate affecting response to your vaccine? Or not to your vaccine, to Zostavax?
Yeah. Well, so, Jeff Curtis and I just finished this big RCT called the VERVE trial. It's being submitted right now, and we vaccinated like 671 people on TNF blockers with or without methotrexate and low-dose prednisone, and we gave them Zostavax or placebo. We had 0 cases of vaccine-induced Zoster in that group. That was impressive. TNF blocker plus methotrexate plus prednisone, no safety concern whatsoever. In terms of immunogenicity, we did see diminished immunogenicity, kind of similar to what we saw in this TOFA study that we were talking about earlier. It was definitely there. There's definitely some action by the vaccine, but it wasn't as robust as what would be seen in a healthy person. Perfect.
So just to finish, any take-home messages for the clinician from really your 2 studies looking at Zostavax with JAKs, and should we treat all JAKs the same? There's unlikely to be any differences between them. Your comment on filgotinib appreciated.
Yeah, sure. I'll take the last first. I think for right now, most of JAKs look the same. I think Filgo, in terms of their Zoster risk, I think Filgo does have this lower risk of Zoster in their phase 3 studies and their phase 2 studies. Certainly, there's differences in those studies in terms of where they were done and some of the makeup of the subjects, and whatnot, and obviously the time period is different. So it's hard to compare, Peter, between these experiences. But suffice it to say, the other 3 JAK programs had pretty similar rates in their programs, and the Filgo program is lower. So we'll just have to see if that holds up in the real world. But I think it's hypothesis generating that there might be a differential risk. In terms of how to handle patients now, so if you're in a place like Australia, wish I was there, then it sounds like you have access to Zostavax, and I would use it, and I would actually feel comfortable giving it to people on TNF blockers, methotrexate, and prednisone, based on our study. And I would not feel comfortable giving it to people who are on JAK inhibitors, but I would give it to people prior to JAK inhibitors, like we did our study. And I would test them for their IgG beforehand if they don't have a known, if they can't tell you they had chickenpox with their kid. And I would use Zostavax, and I think it will provide some protection for a couple years until you get access to Shingrix, and until we have data, with Shingrix, and kind of have a better sense of how to use it and how efficacious it is and how safe it is. So I think we'll be doing those studies, and if you're in a place that you don't have access to it, I would just continue using Zostavax for now, because I do think it will provide some short-term benefit.
Thank you very much for that. Just final comment. Weinblatt published that there wasn't flares from Shingrix. Have you found any rheumatoid flares from the kill vaccine?
Yeah, I think they had like 400 people that it was just kind of a, observational study of 400 people, various autoimmune diseases, most with RA, but also some other conditions. And yeah, I think 6.7% of people flared, although they didn't really look very systematically for flare. They didn't do any sort of efficacy or immunogenicity work. It was really just a convenience kind of sample. But I think it was useful because it did suggest that there's probably a rate of flare that's no different than normal. So that's something we're going to look at very systematically, in the several weeks after vaccination with, flare tools, et cetera, and really try to get a better estimate. But I found Mike's experience to be reassuring.
Great. So thank you very much again for your expertise and giving up your time, Kevin. This has been the CSF Author Interview Podcast. If you'd like to know more about this paper and others uploaded to the CSF website this month, you can get detailed slide sets available in the publication section. Go to cytokinesignalingwith2Ls.com. Please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast from, and give us some feedback and let us know what you think. Thank you very much, Kevin.
You bet. Thanks, Peter. Stay well down there.